Broadcasting from Nairobi on 94.4, Mombasa 87.9, 102.5 in Kisumu, 96.0 in Nakuru, 96.7 in Eldoret, 90.9 in Nyeri. In Malindi is 97.7. We also live stream the show on spicefm.co.ke and spicefm KE on YouTube, on Facebook, and on Twitter. For the next 2 hours, we are also live on KTN Home. A very good morning to our audience on KTN Home. Welcome. This is the second hour of the Situation Room. Let's begin the hour with today's proverb from C.T. Muga.
Right. No one can outwit their ancestors.
No one can outwit their ancestors.
Yes.
Where is this proverb from?
This is an African proverb. When you find something which is not extremely cryptic, it's bound to be an African proverb in this sense of the word, that many communities will have something similar. Okay? Yes.
All right. So for the next hour, let's talk about the Horn of Africa and the countries around the Horn of Africa. These are our neighbors, including Somalia, including Sudan, including Ethiopia and the rest. And what's happening in these regions? We have seen some transition in terms of politics. So Somalia has had now, a transitional government, and then now we have a proper federal government that is headed by President Farmajo, and they'll be heading into a new election. They've had issues. We were having a conversation about Somalia the other day on what the Al-Shabaab has been doing, according to a new report by the UN, which is showing that the Al-Shabaab has been able to really raise some serious money over the last 10 months. And they're even able now to bring it through the financial system by laundering it through real estate and the rest. We were discussing that, and the person that we talked to, who's an expert on the region, the Horn of Africa, and especially in Somalia, was telling us, look, some of these areas where Al-Shabaab is very strong, it's because the government's presence is very weak. And you need then to look at how to strengthen the presence of the government so that then you can more definitively defeat the presence of the Al-Shabaab in the area. We also now talk about Sudan. Just the other day, we saw, and we were discussing it in the news yesterday, the move towards normalization of ties between Sudan and the United States because of what they had initially been called and branded state sponsor of terror. Now they've gotten to a point where they've agreed that you're going to pay some amount of money for victims of terrorism that you've been accused of orchestrating. And with that, we shall look at how to then lift and remove you from this position of state sponsor of terror. And others. Ethiopia, several things happening in Ethiopia in terms of, demonstrations all the time. We had a change of government. We have a prime minister who's been there for a while, but we still see demonstrations and street demonstration protests going on. Still that tussle of who is in charge of government here. Is it all representative? Are there some people who's feeling outside? What that does is, of course, it creates issues in terms of politics. So let's look at what that all means in terms of geopolitics in the region and how that also fits in with us in Kenya. To help us discuss this, let's bring in Ambassador Alex Rondos. He is the EU Special Representative to the Horn of Africa, and he's joining us now online. Good morning, Ambassador.
Good morning to you all. Very pleased to be with you.
Glad to have you. Welcome to the Situation Room.
Thank you.
So let's talk about now the geopolitics trends in the Horn of Africa. And I just want to start by asking you, what are these trends that you see from your vantage position?
Yeah, I think this is, we're at a very unusual moment in this region. But then, to be fair, we're in an unusual moment globally. What we've been noticing from our perspective as the European Union is a real growing activity, interest, involvement in the region by just a growing array of actors. There's traditionally been Western actors. China's been involved. More recently, we see a lot of activity coming from the Gulf, the UAE, Qatar. But what makes this relevant? It's fantastic that everyone takes an interest in the region. The issue is this competitive? Is it all occurring collectively in the best interests of the region? These are the questions we'd be asking ourselves. And at a time when you have an intersection of growing global interest in this region with what you've just been describing, which is the changes that are occurring within several countries in the Horn, how that will emerge, what will really emerge from that, I think is one of the big questions that we should, it's well worth discussing and trying to understand. A simple way of putting it that I think is relevant to the history of this region, certainly of Kenya, is there a new scramble for this region as there was 150 years ago or more?
Is there a scramble for this region? Is that what we're looking at? And then who would be the powers at play here?
The powers at play, I happen to believe that there is a scramble. And it's a scramble that is, it's not necessarily, it's not an ill-intentioned scramble. It speaks to the fact that the region is, I think, seen by many parties as an area of potentially economic interest. There is competition, I think, let's put it ideologically, from some quarters. It's also Eastern Africa. If you go all the way from, let's say, Sudan, the coastline, right down through Kenya, Tanzania, is the eastern. This is the eastern shore of Africa, and it abuts some of the most important trade routes, which comes through the Indian Ocean, up through the Red Sea and into the Mediterranean. So these are all the dynamics and factors that contribute to what looks like a scramble, or another way of looking at it is to say there's a bit of a traffic jam because everyone's beginning to take such an interest. And it's in our collective interests, I believe, to find ways to see that a region like this can help navigate its own way through this sort of traffic jam.
But this scramble, as you describe it now, is it a scramble that is geared towards helping the countries in this region then develop, or is it a scramble for influence, like what we see with the countries that are coming into Somalia or trying to have operations in the region? Are they coming to control, have influence in the region, or are they just coming to take advantage of good relations with the countries?
Frankly, I think it's a mix of both. If you want to have influence, you want to have aspects of control. If you want to gain access to markets, you want to influence. And, I just say this utterly neutrally. It's unfortunately standard practice. And it's not just this region. You see it elsewhere. So that's why I say, I flip the question a bit and ask myself, is the region ready to address this degree of interest and what has been a heightened degree of interest? Now, part of it is related to what I think is growing competition and differences globally. We know that the major superpowers are not so much in competition, but they clearly would appear to be at odds. We'd love to see more cooperation. We know that there are differences that have emerged in the Gulf, for example, and what happened in the split in the GCC. To what degree will that be reflected competitively in this region? You alluded to Somalia earlier. That's an area and a country which, ideally one would like to see protected from these kinds of protected from the export of foreign competition onto African soil. Let me put it that way.
How would this protection be put into play?
I believe that if you look at, let's say, Somalia, for example, I would love to see the African Union, I'd love to see IGAD, the regional organization, be actively engaged in. Somalia is part of those two organizations, and to the degree to which the African Union which has troops, and Kenya contributes to that force, can play a political and diplomatic role in helping Somalia be protected from as I say, this sort of competition climbing in, which may not ultimately be to Somalia's best interests.
Would you say that there are similarities to what you were discussing to that, or to what is currently happening in the Arctic region? Because, well, global warming, we are informed, not warning, that because of global warming, certain things that were previously considered unattainable within that region of the Arctic are now attainable. Mm-hmm. People realize there are vast natural resources. Trade routes have now opened up where previously they hadn't. Would you say the sort of attention that the Arctic region is being given is similar to the one that the Horn of Africa is now receiving?
Yes. Yes and no, and I'll tell you why. This is a very interesting question you put there. Yes. Why? Because a lot of this is about natural resources and the safe passage of natural resources. Think about it, a lot of the interest is whether it's hydrocarbons, minerals, or whatever. How does one reach them? How does one then transport them beyond and to other markets? What is interesting is where the analogy begins to stop is that the Arctic is, as it were, unpopulated.
Yep.
There are no humans inhabiting the Arctic, let me put it this way, sovereign entities, countries with populations who have their own kind of agency in this. Now, you come to this region, which is very populous with an incredibly dynamic political scene. When people come in, the issue is with whom are they dealing? Who invites them? How are they facilitated? Is it to the greater good? Is it to the lesser good and the like? That is the difference I would make in your analogy.
But consider this. There are what you call the Arctic 8 countries that border the Arctic, okay? Now, each of those countries claim some part of the Arctic. So would you say that given the proximity that the Arctic has with these countries provides an even more interesting scenario for competition and perhaps possible conflict?
Are you talking about the Arctic?
I am talking about the Arctic.
The Arctic?
Yes.
Potentially, yes. And I think what we're seeing right now is a lot of work to be done to see if there's a way one can set up some system by which to, convert the potential for conflict into some organized form of cooperation. That's why, I may be out of step with the times, but that's why we created multilateral systems.
By the same measure, now looking into the Horn, Ambassador, and then saying that if we look at different countries, whether we're looking at Sudan, South Sudan, whether we're looking at Somalia, Somaliland, is it that now are we seeing a concerted effort to help out in terms of what is going wrong, or are we seeing a push for personal country interests in the area? There's a big difference between the two. What exactly are we seeing playing out here?
Very difficult to judge right now. That's why this conversation is actually so timely. We are seeing such changes occurring in the region that the very dynamic among countries of the region is shifting. How power balances within countries seems to me to be shifting as well. If you look at Sudan or Ethiopia, and perhaps even in Somalia in the weeks and months ahead. Now, the way I would look at it is to say, while all these changes are occurring, is the region got the capacity to organize itself and be organized politically in the form of some kind of institutional way to be able to manage what is coming in, the interest. Now, that's not to diminish what individual countries and the relations they want to have, but there is a real question right now, I would say and argue, that it's like with us in the European Union. There's a very interesting analogy. At what point do you create a level of cooperation so that you become a bit more of you begin to integrate more economically, to have a collective interest with which to deal with the world outside? It is not easy. But if you don't do that, you then become nothing more than a cascade of bilateral relations and interests in which competition plays a major role. And that can be productive sometimes. It can also be quite insidious if it's not managed and contained.
Okay. If we look at the situation that's unfolding in Sudan right now, and we look at the declarations that were made by the President of the United States in terms of what Sudan could do essentially to get itself back into the good books of the US. There are very many layers in that declaration. One would see that it would help Sudan get off the list of, all the bans and etc. At the same time, again, so helping the country get out of this issue, at the same time, again, in the middle of an interest further up in the Gulf between the United States and Israel. How do you see this situation playing out here? Just off the cuff of what you've just said in terms of interest vis-a-vis countries' needed help and assistance.
Yeah, I think this is when really a strategic advance is made, and it collides also with immediate opportunism. But this is what often goes on in terms of international politics. But to be more specific, I think I can only commend and applaud the Sudanese for having reached the point where they're able to get the United States, persuade the President of the United States to say that this listing as a state sponsor of terrorism is going to be lifted. And I think it will move to that. It's a process, but it's a huge step. I mean, this country has been isolated for almost 30 years. And Lord knows the people of Sudan deserve something better and to be brought back in. Now, it happens to coincide with a time when there is a normalization occurring in relations in the Middle East between countries in the Gulf, and it was led by the United Arab Emirates with Israel. And so that there is an attempt to normalize more generally is a very welcome thing. The question is simply, is Sudan ready for it? Here is a country that until not long ago was run by an individual, a very narrow clique that didn't see fit necessarily to go to the people to get their opinion or ratification for how the conduct of foreign policy should go. Now there's something different. The public has a say. A government has to respond. And I think this is what we need to, look at. And I think people need to be very sensitive to the fact that, there are opinions in Sudan. There are diversity of opinions. And the pleasant thing at the moment is that they can express themselves. Now, whoever is going to try to arrange and rearrange the relations of the country with the world needs to be attentive to the fact that the Sudanese have their own opinions. And not ride roughshod over those or pretend to take them for granted. Because if you do that, it usually ends up, you know what I mean. It leaves a bitter taste in the mouth, and in politics, that's not wise.
And then looking at the other countries in the region and those from other parts of the world that are trying to have a greater influence. So you've talked about the Gulf states, you've talked about America, you've talked about the European countries, and China as well. We cannot leave it out. And the influence that China is trying to exert in the region, in Eritrea, in Djibouti, in Ethiopia. How does that fit with advancing the interests of the people of these countries vis-a-vis it's not really competition, but what exactly is playing out between, for example, China and the United States?
Look, maybe it's something, Lord knows, it's part of my business to deal with the whole time, but here's my take on it. All these countries, I include my member states and the institution that, I speak for, we all need to wake up to something. The Horn of Africa is not just simply a geographical expression. It is a sum of countries with populations that number almost 250, 300 million. What is even more interesting to me is that if we don't take into account the simple demographic reality that in these countries, one has something that is in stark contrast to, say, in Europe, the complete opposite in Europe, where the vast majority of the population is young, is coming onto not only the economic marketplace, but the political marketplace. If one doesn't take that into account, then I don't understand how anyone is going to be able to conduct proper relations with all the countries and the peoples of this region. So I start with that very basic question that I put to myself and my colleagues. And I think that's a question that all these countries need to ask themselves. Is one simply dealing with the government? Is one trying to deal with the people of the country? And I'm not being naive here. I understand exactly, what I'm getting at. And, if a China comes in, does China, is it concerned about the stability, the prosperity, or, if you will, the degree to which the people of the country participate in the decisions about the fate of the nation? These are issues that I think everyone who comes into this region has a slightly different approach to it. And I would just simply say that that's something that everyone has to be very, very attentive to.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Alex Rondos, for speaking to us and, helping us to understand what's happening in the Horn of Africa, what's happening in the relations between these countries in the Horn and the relations between within the countries in the Horn and the rest of the world. Alex is the EU Special Representative to the Horn of Africa. He is obviously an expert in this area. He's here to work on the relations between these countries and the EU. Asante sana for speaking to us, and I wish you a great day.
It's very my pleasure, and thank you for having me.
Thank you very much.